You're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet, and we are pitting facts against falling into a K-hole. Today on the show, ketamine. You might know it as a horse tranquilizer or even a party drug. But these days, there's all this talk that it can treat depression and a whole bunch of other mental health conditions. So we want to know, is this for real? And in today's episode, we are talking about suicidal thoughts and depression. So please take care when you're listening to the show. And if you are feeling depressed or you just want to talk to someone, we'll put some numbers that you can call in our show notes. Okay, let's get started. Fernanda Gracioli is a web developer from Massachusetts. And ever since she was a little kid, she struggled with depression.
I would have these periods of time where I would come home from school, for example, and I would just cry for an hour or 2 hours, and I wouldn't want to do anything. I didn't want to play. I just wanted to be in my room by myself. And that was when I was a really little kid. But by the time I was 10, I was truly depressed, like grown-up depressed.
In her teens, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she'd have these terrible bouts of depression. Doctors prescribed her all sorts of meds, but nothing really worked, which is true for maybe a third of people with depression and bipolar. Several years ago, things got really bad. Fernanda was having suicidal thoughts.
I was catatonic. I couldn't speak very much, I couldn't feed myself. My partner was feeding me at the time because I couldn't care for myself. I don't think I would have lasted much longer. And, I talked to my partner about this beforehand, and she completely agrees that I was very close to the end.
But meanwhile, a surprising new treatment was right in front of her.
I was just sitting on the couch and I picked up a magazine and I was flipping through it and I saw an article in it about a guy who sounded just like me.
He'd also had really bad depression. And what helped him was ketamine. Fernanda decided to give it a shot. She found a ketamine clinic, went to see a doctor there, and a few days later, she was in a comfy recliner chair, IV drip connected to her arm, and ketamine started flowing into her blood.
It feels like I'm going to try to put this into words. Sorry, I want to pause for a second. When it first hits you and you start feeling it, your body starts to feel a little funny. Something's happening to your body, but you're not 100% sure what yet. And then it feels like I have no control over my body. I have no control over where my thoughts go. A few minutes in, my body gets really heavy. I really truly become almost paralyzed. And it feels like my body is gigantic. I'm the size of the building.
And then it was almost like her mind was moving out of her body.
I was completely gone from the room. To me, it looks very dark, but it feels very calm.
The feeling faded after about an hour. And at first, Fernanda didn't see any changes with her depression. She kept going back, though, and it was after her fourth session that something really switched.
I was ecstatic. I was so happy. I had hope for the first time in so long. It was like that promise of bringing me back to life, the possibility that I would go from being so close to wanting to end everything to being able to not feel the constant pain like that. There's no better feeling in the world than feeling like you were in pain for your entire life and now you're not anymore. I was telling everybody about it.
And there are tons of stories like Fernanda's out there. So today we're asking, what is the science on ketamine? Like, can it really turn things around for loads of people who are struggling with their mental health? And what are the risks here? Because some people say that ketamine can be a dangerous drug that can mess you up from your bladder to your brain. So we are going to get to the bottom of all of this by diving into a K-hole of our own. A K-hole of science. The best kind of K-hole. Science versus ketamine is coming up just after the break. Welcome back. Today on the show, we are snorting up the science on ketamine. And even though these days people are saying that this drug can help with loads of different things, its potential as a treatment for depression is what really started this ketamine craze. So, for decades, ketamine has been used as an anesthetic to put people under, even to put horses under, hence the horse tranquilizer. But to start our story, we're going back to the 2000s. Picture it. People are still obsessed with Gilmore Girls, which I don't get. Snoop Dogg was dropping it like it's hot, which I do get. And in the lab, scientists were seeing that sometimes when they gave people ketamine, their mood seemed to lift. And so some started thinking, could we try this as a medicine for depression?
I thought it was an interesting idea. I didn't, at that time there was so little that had been done.
Rebecca Price, who's now an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh, helped with one of the first clinical trials looking into this. She was a grad student at the time working with researchers who wanted to see whether ketamine could actually help people with depression and suicidal thoughts. Her team got around 24 patients who were dealing with this, where other medication hadn't worked. They had them come into the hospital, and for this kind of thing, patients would get hooked up to an IV.
And then you're going to slowly be administered the medication over about 40 minutes.
And the researchers wanted to know, after the effects of the drug wore off, did they feel any better? So she had them stay overnight in the lab, and her team checked them again 24 hours later after the ketamine. And she told us that she wasn't expecting much. All the thinking at the time was that depression can be stubborn, very hard to treat. Classic antidepressants and even therapy can take weeks or months to kick in. But what she saw blew her mind.
These patients had tried everything, nothing had helped. And then I would come back literally the next day, and it was almost like talking to a different human being with this whole different mindset and outlook. They were just well.
Before the infusion, about half of the patients had actually been borderline suicidal. The next day, most of them were having no suicidal thoughts. None.
Suddenly, we had almost like a depression switch that could be flipped, and that was something really new. So that was very hard to ignore.
It was hard for lots of academics to ignore that a drug could have this kind of antidepressant effect just 24 hours later. In fact, researchers all over the world were jumping on this, like Professor Colleen Loo with the Black Dog Institute at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, over in Australia. Colleen had started testing ketamine in her severely depressed patients.
And I must say, I was astounded.
And Colleen wanted to know, could this be due to the good old placebo effect? So she set up a small trial to find out, when neither she nor her patients knew whether they were getting ketamine or a placebo. And she found it still worked. Yeah, this will be a familiar story by now, but Colleen told us about one of her patients. He'd been depressed for ages, nothing helped, he got ketamine, and the very next day...
He looked like a completely different person. And he was astounded. We were both sitting there. It's very funny because, colleagues of mine who were skeptical say,
podcast is on Spotify. It's called,
but in fact, it was exactly the opposite.
Science
he was
versus...
saying to me, I'm having trouble believing I could feel so well one day later. And I said to him, I'm having trouble believing it as well, that you look so well compared to the person I saw yesterday. We both actually had trouble believing, what we were seeing with our own eyes.
Wow.
It's truly remarkable when you see it, because I don't know of any other treatments in psychiatry where you can get someone from being seriously depressed to being well in one day.
These days, there are dozens of studies which find that as soon as people with really bad depression get ketamine, it can help. And based on some of that data, in 2019, the FDA approved a version of ketamine treatment for people who have depression where other meds haven't worked. It was even fast-tracked as a breakthrough therapy.
Spot open in
And
front
so our
end.
next question is,
So the question
how
is
this
that
happening?
your spot
Like,
or
what
your
is going
partner's
on in
spot?
the brain of someone who's depressed after they have ketamine? And Colleen told us that to get to the bottom of that, you first have to know what's happening in the brain of someone who's been
Finally
depressed
getting away from
for a
that
long
place
time.
or what?
In some parts of
Oh,
your
I see.
brain, your brain cells can actually shrink and they become a bit sick.
Where did he go? Did he
for
did he
decades,
just
in fact,
quit
people have
or
said, when they're quite
not show
depressed,
up or
my
what?
brain doesn't work. Like I can't think, I can't remember things.
There's also evidence that the connections between neurons change in people who have depression. It's almost like if you imagine your brain as a whole bunch of roads that allow you to drive to different places and think different thoughts. When you've had depression for a long time, it can be harder to make new roads in some parts of your brain. But some research is showing that ketamine might be changing that. So, for example, we know that when you take ketamine, it gets up into your brain and can latch onto a receptor that lives on our brain cells. And this triggers a domino effect, which can do a bunch of stuff, like change how an important neurotransmitter called glutamate works in our brain. And all this could just really shake things up in there.
Yes, it kind of loosens up your brain circuits, which we think actually allows people to escape from the circuits where they're stuck. You know how often people ruminate or they're stuck in a negative pattern of thinking they can't get out of it? And what ketamine does, and that's why some people feel a bit weird for half an hour, so when they're under the influence, it kind of almost like liberates your brain to allow it to think in different ways.
And even after ketamine is gone and out of your system, some of those circuitry changes seem to stick around. So from studies in rodents, you can see that after these little tackers get ketamine, this kind of amazing thing happens. Their brain cells and the branches that they use to talk to each other
Plump up and regrow.
That's such a lovely image, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they've actually shown this.
Oh, really?
Yes. Many done in animal studies where they give the animals ketamine and look at it under a microscope. So when I say that their brain cells are growing new connections, literally that's what they're seeing in these microscope slices.
Wow. Yeah. Studies are finding that after rodents get ketamine, some neurons are chatting and connecting that weren't before. Now, obviously, the brain and depression is super complicated and scientists are still muddling through all this. But what we're finding is that ketamine is a very interesting drug. Have you ever tried ketamine?
No, actually, I haven't.
Really? Are you not curious?
Oh, look, I'm very curious. The issue would be, Wendy, how one would, legally and properly try ketamine. So because the prescription is so strict.
Yes, you'd have to get it off the street, Colleen.
Well, exactly. But
what makes you curious?
I think just in seeing, because I've heard from so many patients what it's like, it would just be really curious to experience it yourself, to have a first-hand knowledge of that. What is actually happening subjectively.
Got to
at
the
brain
point
level.
where he just said,
Yeah.
fuck it.
Yeah, that's such a wonderfully nerdy way to probably explain why a lot of people take it, isn't it? So, this is all sounding pretty great for ketamine.
Well, I hope he enjoys his
But
time
we gotta
on
hold our
floors.
horses
It's
here.
really,
Which some
really a
tranquilizer might help
great
with.
place to be.
Because there are claims that ketamine
Doesn't get any
can
better
mess
than
up your
floors.
bladder and your brain. And that is coming up after the break.
I'm Yasi Salek, and I'm the host of Bandsplain, a show where we explain cult bands and iconic artists by going deep into their histories and discographies. We're back with a brand new season at our brand new home, the Ringer Podcast Network, tackling a whole new batch of artists, from grunge gods to power pop pioneers to nu metal legends, and many, many more. Listen to new episodes every Thursday, only on Spotify.
Welcome back. So far, ketamine is looking pretty darn fabulous. But now, it's time to crash the party. Because while those early studies got scientists saying, giddy up, Dr. Rebecca Price told us that as researchers have kept looking into this, some of the newer studies are a little more meh.
As is often the case in science, the initial findings were a little too good to be true.
So a big thing is that ketamine doesn't help everyone who's getting it. Far from it. Rebecca just brought together data from more than 350 patients who had used ketamine and found that 24 hours later, it only helped around half of them. Another study found that for about 8% of people, their depression actually got worse after taking ketamine. And the thing is, even when it does work, perhaps a bigger bummer here is that on average, the benefits don't stick around for long.
A typical patient who gets a good response to a single infusion of ketamine will get about a week to 2 weeks of relief and then be back sort of where they started. But that's not particularly helpful. Maybe in certain circumstances, like a crisis, a situation, but patients want to feel better a lot longer than 1 or 2 weeks.
While some people can have these amazing responses to ketamine and feel better for months after, for most people, it's not like that. Which is all a bit befuddling for scientists working in this space, given all of those things that they're seeing in the brain. But for now, the next big push is to figure out a way to make the benefits of ketamine
Thursday, he went
last
home earlier.
longer.
Before he left, he
They're
said, fuck you,
trying
you're
all kinds of things, like combining ketamine
Oh,
with therapy, upping people's doses, or just giving people ketamine week after week after week, which might help a little. But according to the studies, a lot of people are still relapsing.
Sounds like he's got a
We
good
talked about this
attitude.
with Gerard Sanacora, a professor of neuroscience at Yale University.
What's the end game? So great, we're going to treat you, and we have a good chance of getting you feeling significantly better. Then what? Then what are you going to do? You're going to need to take this treatment for the rest of your life.
And here is where the science on ketamine falls into a K-hole of its own. A few years ago,
Yeah,
Gerard
sounds
was
like
asked
the
to
same
write a
old
report
Wilsons.
for the American Psychiatric Association, and his task was to write guidelines for how doctors should use ketamine.
Pretty tempting to
You know,
go back
basic
to
things
driving
like
fucking
how much should you use?
3
How
hours
often?
a
The
night.
best way to give it.
Put
The
up with that
reality
fucking
that
shit.
we came to very quickly is, well,
fuck.
we really can't write guidelines because there just isn't enough information. You need information to write guidelines, and we don't have enough information. You know, we know at this point there are tens of thousands of people around the country being treated, but what is the right dose? What is the frequency that should be used? We don't know this.
So that's where the research is at with ketamine and depression. But now there's all this excitement that ketamine can help with a whole bunch of other stuff. Our producer, Michelle Dang, talked to Gerard about it.
Some of these sites I've read, like they list treating autism or work stress or insomnia.
Boredom.
Have you seen it advertised for boredom?
No, I haven't necessarily, but I'm joking there.
Gerard, please, leave the jokes to the professionals.
I mean, people are listing, so many different things.
And other than depression, where we have the next best data is in PTSD and OCD. And even for those conditions, some studies suggest that ketamine can help and others don't.
soon as you get
A big review on
supervisor,
bipolar disorder found
come
that
back.
there's some evidence
That
it can
way I
help
know you're
24
running the
hours
show
later,
and
but on
I know
average,
what to expect.
again, the
I can-
benefits don't last long.
I can camp out in the
Generally speaking,
locker
Gerard
room
says
and let my
it
partner
makes
do all
sense
the work.
to try other stuff first.
So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use it. I want to be careful because we wouldn't do anything in medicine if we needed to be 100% sure of what everything was. It's just to jump to something like ketamine before you try something like cognitive behavioral therapy, to me seems, a really poor decision. People are desperate for treatments. Clinicians really are trying to help people for the most part. It's just, you can't let the cart get ahead of the horse.
Which is easy to do because the horse has been tranquilized. Can we make this joke too many times? Nay. Okay, so our final question for today is this. What are the downsides of taking ketamine? Like, why wouldn't you just give it a go anyway? Well, for one, there are some side effects. Soon after you start an infusion, your heart rate can go up and you can feel nauseated. Fernanda told us that an infusion of ketamine made her feel
Nauseous, extremely nauseous, disoriented. Walking was really difficult because I felt like the ground was moving underneath me. It was really physically taxing.
So that's soon after you get ketamine. But what about in the longer term? Like if people are going to be taking this for the rest of their lives? Well, Colleen over in Australia wrote a big paper on this. And she said that because a lot of this depression research is pretty new, where we have the most long-term data is in people who took ketamine for funsies.
Which is a very messy literature because basically we don't know what dose people are using, how often they're using it, and what else they're using it with.
It's not regulated.
Still though, she scoured through that messy literature to see, was anything bad happening in these people?
And there were some quite worrying reports.
And one of the weirdest things has to do with our pee plumbing, the bladder and urinary tract. Because for some recreational users,
You feel you need to go to the toilet often. It feels a bit of burning and stinging when you pass urine, that
Sweet.
kind of thing.
yeah, like that barbed wire
Fun times.
feeling.
Yeah.
If you've ever had a UTI, she says it's a bit like that. And here's why ketamine might mess up your bladder. So when ketamine gets broken down in your liver, the little breakdown products move into your bladder,
Yep.
and there they can irritate the lining of your pee balloon. Colleen says that in really rare cases where people are using a ton of ketamine to party, it can get so bad that the bladder has to be removed. A paper from about 10 years ago called ketamine, quote, a murderer of young bladders, which is a Knives Out sequel that I am not ready for. Anyway, this is not common. But Colleen says she has seen the odd irritated bladder in her clinics too. And she says it's only a real problem if you keep taking ketamine after you feel those symptoms.
Right, so if it's caused by a reaction to ketamine and its breakdown products, then once you flush out ketamine, as painful as that might be, then does your bladder go back to normal?
Exactly. So it's not as if it happens then, oh no, this is terrible and we're having a serious problem. It means that it's starting to irritate the bladder. And what we do is we then say, okay, we need to give the bladder a rest, and it recovers.
So that is the whiz machine. But Colleen also found that for people taking ketamine recreationally, some of them had problems with their thinking and memory.
Underlying problems.
So, for example, there was this one study that got a bunch of people, some who used ketamine a lot, we're talking at least 4 times a week, and then others who just dabbled with it, say once a month, and others who didn't use ketamine at all. They followed them for a year and found that the ones who used ketamine a lot, they did worse on memory tests. But the thing is, while we don't have much long-term data here, studies into people using ketamine for depression, who are probably taking less of the drug, they're not seeing problems here.
In fact, all the research studies and also the clinics are not finding any cognitive issues as a result of ketamine.
For Fernanda, who has been taking ketamine fairly regularly, she said about 6 months in, she actually did develop some problems with her memory. Overall, we just really need more data on this. And then finally, if we're talking about drugs, we better talk about addiction. It is possible to get addicted to ketamine. We found a case report of a nurse who they rather conveniently called Mrs. K. She was using ketamine to help with her depression, and at first it was very helpful.
But after a while, the same dose wasn't as helpful, so she was taking a higher and higher dose and just kept going up and up and up.
She started stealing it from the hospital she worked at until one day she was found confused and euphoric with 14 ketamine vials and matching syringes stuffed into her pockets and purse.
Nice.
Other researchers wrote that ketamine has, quote, the potential for misuse and addiction.
Addiction, yeah.
Now, the frustrating thing is
Depends on
that
your
we don't know how many
personality.
Mrs. Ks there are out there.
You have an addictive
We do have one small
personality.
study from last year that asked people who took ketamine for depression if they had any cravings for it afterwards, and most people didn't.
Yeah, I don't think from everything I've seen that ketamine is highly addictive. And in fact, patients coming through our clinic often say, I don't know how this is a drug of addiction.
They're not having that much fun at your clinic, is that what you're saying?
Well, exactly. It's not like they're getting a euphoric high. What they're coming for is the lifting in mood.
So when it comes to ketamine, how does it stack up? Miracle cure or just another fad? Well, ketamine doesn't help everyone. A lot of people with depression don't get better after they take it. And even for those it does help, on average, the benefits aren't sticking around for long. Plus, there are side effects. Still though, this doesn't mean that ketamine is useless. Like for Fernanda, she goes back for infusions every few months, and she says that while this isn't some miracle drug that completely took away her mental health problems, in fact, she still takes other, more traditional medication. For her, this has still been huge.
It is ketamine, and it was ketamine that keeps me not only functional, but actually feeling well. I don't want to sound like super dramatic when I say this, but I really was very close to the end. I was very close to making the choice to just that it wasn't worth it anymore. And ketamine took away all the reasons why I thought it wasn't worth it anymore, and gave me many, many reasons to feel like this is all very much worth it. Ketamine has given me my life back.
That's Science Versus.
Hello.
Hey, Michelle, how's America?
Oh, it's dark. How are you?
All right, well, I shall let you sleep soon then. Producer Michelle Dang, how many citations are in this week's episode?
There are 101 citations this week.
101?
Yes, not Dalmatians citations.
Not Dalmatian citations. If people want to see these citations, where should they go?
Head over to our show notes, and there's a link to our transcript with all the citations.
And next week, Michelle, what is next week's episode?
Oh, there's a mini episode on beavers.
It involves some very sexy beaver talk?
Did you just say sexy beaver talk?
Yes.
That's true. I think that's fair. It's like, beaver sexy time, but also the sexy things they're doing for the environment.
Very nicely done. Thanks, Michelle.
All right. Thanks, Wendy. See ya.
Bye. This episode was produced by Michelle Dang, me, Wendy Zuckerman, Irene Natavich, Joel Werner, Rose Rimler, and Meryl Horn. We're edited by Blythe Terrell. Gimlet's managing director is Nicole Beams-DeBoer. Fact-checking by Erica Akiko Howard. Mix and sound design by Catherine Anderson. Music written by Bobby Lord, Peter Leonard, Bumi Hidaka, So Wiley, and Emma Munger.
Alright,
Thank you
go
to the
next
research.
one.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet. Today on the show, we're pitting facts against ferocious dogs. As we ask, are some dog breeds, like pit bulls, inherently dangerous? Several weeks ago, our senior producer Meryl Horn and her husband Chris Suter got a DNA test for their dog, Penny.
Come here.
Penny. So they could find out Penny's breed. They thought she was a black lab mix, but wondered what else might be lurking under the surface here. So they basically got her a 23andMe, but for dogs. Meryl and Chris had to swab Penny's cheek.
Oh, she's a little nervous.
Which was a little tricky.
We're gonna do science.
Come here, Penny. You're gonna get a treat soon.
But they got it. She got a little treat. Penny, not Meryl.
Good girl, Penny.
They sent it off and a few weeks later got an email. And Meryl couldn't wait for the reveal.
All right, I'm gonna click the results. I guess there's a little video that we can watch. It says, a perfect mix of 5 breeds. This is the breed reveal. Whoa, American Pit Bull Terrier was the first hit. German Shepherd.
Oh, better sell it. It's got pit in it.
Chow Chow.
Oh.
What?
Yeah.
Boxer. And
Yeah.
one more Rottweiler.
Ah, fuck, it's
she's like a
over.
combination of all the worst dogs.
Oh, fuck.
Except for bad things about Rottweilers, pit bulls, of course,
Chows.
and Chow Chows are supposedly one of the more aggressive
Yep.
ones.
Really aggressive.
Very aggressive.
Yeah, her biggest one is
I know from
definitely pit
personal
bull,
experience.
40%.
As you can hear, Meryl is a bit taken aback, seeing that her dog was a mix of all these breeds. I talked to her about it. What was so worrying to you?
I mean, I think I've always just had this idea that there are some dogs out there that are scarier than others. And it felt like this is what you would get if somebody intentionally tried to create a dog from all the scariest breeds. You'd end up with Penny. It did make me think about all these little like signs that she might have aggression problems. Like the first time I met her, she snapped at me. And she did bite somebody once.
Whoa.
Like maybe she does have this darker side to her, and it's scary. Like now we have a toddler.
Ooh. And the part of Penny that freaked Meryl out the most was the fact that a big chunk of her DNA was pit bull. Pit bulls are one of the most controversial dog breeds around. In the news, there are these terrifying stories of people being mauled to death by these dogs.
Tragic death in San Bernardino County tonight involving a pit bull.
The 44-year-old mauled to death, killed by her 8-year-old pit bull.
We went to go and play with him, and something in him just switched.
Don't trust them. Don't trust pit bulls, because they could change at any moment.
And dog bites are a big deal. More than 300,000 people go to the ER for dog bites in the US each year. 300,000. And a lot of the victims tend to be little kids. And some say that the dogs most often to blame here are pit bulls. Yeah, there's this whole anti-pit bull movement that have, let's say, no pity for the pity. They say these dogs are inherently dangerous, that it's like their whole body is designed as a weapon. You'll find articles and forums saying that pit bulls have a terrifying bite force that can crush a child's skull. And because of all this, several places like the UK and Denmark have basically banned these dogs. But then there is another side to all this. You've got the pit bull lovers, the pity posse. And they reckon we've got it all wrong. Pit bulls are loving, wonderful pets, they say. And if there's some bad apples, some dogs that bit some people, well then it's the owner's fault. And this debate has gotten so nasty that several years ago, BuzzFeed called it the most vicious conflict on the internet.
This is quite a story. You have, so some people, they are inherently loving. The other side, they are inherently dangerous.
Yeah, it's like people are living into alternate universes.
And both sides say they have the data.
Yeah.
This is the kind of science versus story I love, when everyone thinks the science is on their side.
Yeah.
So today on the show, are pit bulls truly bad to the bone? Forget the dogma, because when it comes to pit bulls,
We're going to do science.
Science Versus will be right back after the break. So stay. Sit. Stay. Good listener. Welcome back. Today we're looking at dog breeds and asking whether some dogs, like pit bulls, really are just inherently more aggressive and dangerous. So after Meryl Horn, our senior producer, realized that she was basically the owner of a pit bull, she dove into the research on this. And Meryl is going to tell us what she found.
Hi.
So where did you start? Step one.
I mean, I think I just started Googling, like, are pit bulls bad? And saw, like,
that PhD counting for something, Meryl.
Yes, I used my research skills to Google, and one thing that came up right away to explain why pit bulls might be dangerous is that they have this kind of dodgy breeding history.
Where do they come from?
Well, if you go back far enough, the ancestors of pit bulls were these dogs that were bred to fight bulls.
Oh my gosh. Oh, hence pit bull.
Yeah. And then generations down the line, these dogs were used to fight other dogs. So it's just kind of a lot of blood and violence throughout pit bull breeding history. But the truth is that we bred a lot of dogs for violent purposes. Like beagles are used to hunt rabbits, and Rhodesian Ridgebacks were bred to hunt lions.
What?
The first Akitas were hunting wild boars and bears in packs. So you can make this argument like that they were bred for violence about a lot of dog breeds.
Okay, but still, I'm still scared of pit bulls at this point. And all these other dogs now.
Right. The Rhodesian Ridgebacks, you don't want to with those either.
100%, no.
And so then fast forward to today, and one of the big things that you read about on these anti-pit bull websites is this idea that pit bulls are more likely to bite people. They'll point to like all of these studies that seem to back this up. So, like, one of these studies is literally called Mortality, Mauling, and Maiming by Vicious Dogs.
That's some alliteration. And what does this study do?
So they looked at people who were brought into their, it was like a trauma center in Texas, and they looked at what kind of dogs bit these people. And they found that pit bulls were the dogs that were most likely to bite people. And their takeaway is that pit bulls are inherently dangerous and that we should be regulating them like we do with wild animals like leopards.
Wow.
Yeah. And there are dozens of studies like this that show that pit bulls are more likely to attack people and have all these statistics, backing that up.
So case anti-pit bull is looking strong.
Yeah. But then I kept digging into these studies.
Digging. Nice.
Huh?
Isn't that what dogs do? Dig?
Yeah, like a dog after a bone. I dug and dug. And it turns out these studies are kind of a mess. So they've gotten lots of criticism from other scientists. One big reason is that we just don't have any way of controlling for the total number of dogs that are out there. Like, we know lots of people own pit bulls, and so it could just be that if you've got a lot of pit bulls, you have a lot of bites from them too. Like, it's just math.
Right. We have to know what the denominator is, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, so yeah, okay. So in that, maulers, mutilators,
mortality, mauling, and maiming.
Yes, study. If, for example, in Texas, there is a lot of pit bulls, then you would have a lot of people at that hospital with pit bull bites. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are more aggressive dogs.
Yeah, like one study found that the most common dog to kill someone in Canada is a sled dog. Is that because sled dogs are actually the most vicious dog, or is it just because there's a lot of sled dogs in Canada?
And we don't know how many pit bulls there are in America versus other kinds of dogs?
No, we don't. We just don't have these stats. And like, there's also like no real precise definition for what a pit bull even is.
Really?
Yeah. Like there are a few different breeds that are lumped into this category of pit bull, but sometimes people get it wrong. So you got to be careful about which studies you trust. But bottom line, as for those dog bite studies, the American Veterinary Medical Association has said, quote, "Dog bite statistics are not really statistics and do not give an accurate picture of dogs that bite," unquote.
Ooh, that's some rough talk.
Yeah.
But this does then leave us back where we started. So where do we go next?
Yeah, I mean, all of this just made me want to find better studies that I could actually trust.
And you have the same number of dogs to start with.
Yeah, good denominators.
Yes, love a good denominator.
And I talked to someone who did a study like that. Her name is Anna McNeil, and she was also fed up with these crappy denominators, so first we kind of nerd-hated over that for a while.
You have to go by the population. What's the probability that any, the more...
Yes, one of our own.
Yeah.
And so, after looking at all the studies, I realized what we're missing, and I thought, I guess that's one thing that I can contribute to the scientific research is doing a study with the proper methodology.
And then we got to talking about her study. So she started it when she was working on a master's for animal welfare at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And she hooked up with the British Columbia SPCA, an animal shelter, to try to track what happened when people adopted pit bulls. Like how many of them became beloved family dogs and how many of them got returned for things like aggression.
Okay, so what did Anna do?
So the first step was to get some dogs for this study. Anna started categorizing the dogs that came into the shelter as either a pit bull or a non-pit bull for the control group.
There was a Catahoula. I think there might have been a Chow mix.
Catahoula?
One Catahoula.
That sounds like a made-up dog.
No, Catahoula leopard dog.
And so Anna got about 40 pit bulls and 40 of these other dogs for the study, and she looked to see what happened. And so right off the bat, they had to euthanize 5 dogs because they were aggressive towards the animal shelter staff.
Oy.
So 3 pit bulls and 2 of the other dogs got euthanized then.
Okay, so 3 and 2 sounded pretty equal.
Yeah, there wasn't a difference statistically. And then she looked to see what happened after all those other dogs got adopted. So within a couple months, 11 of the dogs were returned for aggression. And so Anna looked, were more of the dogs that were returned pit bulls?
One of them was a pit bull and 10 of them was the non-pit bulls.
Whoa. So only one was a pit bull.
Only one
of those
pit
11
bull
dogs
was returned. Yeah.
Pit bulls were much less likely to be returned for aggression by the owners. So far, so good.
So far, so good.
Then she looked to see, for all of the dogs that were kept, were there any other differences in aggression when these dogs were kind of settling in? And she didn't see any differences in aggression towards, strangers, towards kids, towards the owners, between these two different groups. And in fact, the only difference in behavior between these two groups of dogs that she found had to do with something else.
So they were more likely to sleep on the bed, and they're more likely to cuddle,
Aww.
which is basically considered like touching, leaning, always being in touch with their owner physically.
So the pit bulls were more likely to cuddle with their owners and sleep on their beds.
More likely to cuddle and sleep in the bed.
No, stop it, you two.
You're such a hater. It's adorable. It's an adorable finding to a study. Come on. But it was only 80 dogs.
That's right. That feels very small. Are there any bigger studies?
Yeah, there are. So, we have a study that surveyed thousands of dog owners, and people did say that their pit bulls were more aggressive towards other dogs, but pit bulls weren't more aggressive towards people, according to the owners.
Oh, which kind of makes sense with the breeding history, right? Because part of their breeding was to fight other dogs, not people.
Yeah, exactly. It makes sense. There's also a survey of a couple thousand veterinarians who, presumably don't have a dog in this fight. And according to them, the dogs with the highest risk of giving people severe bites were chow chows, not pit bulls.
Chow chows, okay. Penny had a bit of chow chow in her, right?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, by the way.
This is not particularly
Had
good
one
news
chow,
for
never
Penny,
have another.
but it is quite good news for the reputation of pit bulls. Okay, this does make me wonder though, are there other dogs that we should be looking at in this whole debate? Like, while all this attention is on pit bulls and how nasty they are researchers actually saying, no, look over here, this other dog is the one we should be focusing on?
Yeah, so I actually did find a lot of studies that look at like aggression overall in dogs and do find that certain dogs are more aggressive than others towards people.
Oh.
One guy who's looking into this is Isaín Zapata, assistant professor at Rocky Vista University in Colorado. And he did the best study I could find on this. He started with this huge database of dog owner surveys.
So they have like 60, 70,000 participants in that one.
60 or 70,000 dogs?
Yeah.
Whoa.
So we use all that data to try to kind of classify, what is the differences across breeds.
So they asked the owners all sorts of questions about aggression and then ran the numbers. And?
What we saw is that the most aggressive dogs are the small ones.
The small ones.
The small ones.
Yes, and that is consistent with many other, findings from other people. The size matters a lot.
So, like, what types of dogs?
Small breeds, Chihuahuas, they're mean. They're cute, but they're mean.
Oh, fuck.
So, Isaín and a bunch of other papers often find that small dogs are, on average, more aggressive. Dachshunds, miniature schnauzers also pop up a lot. But one thing to note here is that the differences weren't that big.
In average, they're more likely to be crazy, but it is not like for sure it is going to be crazy.
But Isaín was curious, like, what was making some of these tiny dogs more aggressive? Maybe he could see something in their genes. So Isaín looked at a bunch of doggy DNA, and he told me about this one gene that he found in dachshunds.
And what does a dachshund look like? Remind me. So tiny.
They're the wiener dogs. So it's kind of like a short little hot dog on legs.
Oh, yeah. In Australia, we call them the sausage dogs.
And what he found was that the gene that makes them have those short little legs is right near this other gene that makes dachshunds kind of mean.
And exemplifies, how when we select for something that we want, we can also bring stuff we don't want.
Oh, that's really interesting. So the gene for cute little legs or whatever is sitting very close on the string of DNA to a gene that ups their chance of being a little rat bitch. And so where you copy one, you'll often copy the other.
Yeah, kind of. And I mean, it's not like there's just one gene that determines whether or not you're a little rat bitch. Like, a lot of things could contribute to that, like your environment.
So if you're a very small dog, everything is giant around you. You go to the doggy park and, you're going to be playing with giants.
Yeah.
Your entire experience is molded differently.
And do we have any evidence from other studies that there may be some aggression gene in pit bulls that we accidentally bred for?
Yeah, I actually wanted to know that too. So I asked Isaín that.
We cannot detect it, and we haven't seen it so far.
So you didn't find any like smoking gun here of like an aggression gene in pit bulls?
No, we looked specifically for that within the ones that we evaluated, and we couldn't find it.
Okay. So Chihuahuas, dachshunds, the little ones, the little rat ones, they're the more aggressive. So are pit bulls off the hook completely?
No. So far, all we've been talking about is whether or not they're more aggressive than other dogs. But there's something else that you should know about pit bulls before you cast your judgment.
Okay. And this is coming up after the break?
Yep. And we're going to have to use some crystals and dog cadavers.
Oh, jeepers. Okay.
Choose your own offline listening adventure. Spotify Premium lets you download and take your music on the go. Try 3 free months of Premium now and cancel anytime. Tap the banner to learn more.
If it seems like there are a lot of people quitting their jobs right now, it's because they are.
We're working so hard that we forgot to think about what makes us happy.
I would just sit at my desk and cry.
I just got to the point where I had to say, I don't know if I can do this.
And it's not just quitting. There's a lot of unusual things happening in the economy. Car shortages, soaring lumber prices, inflation. We cover all this and more on The Journal podcast, out every weekday afternoon. Tap now to listen to The Journal on Spotify.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from The Ringer, and this is a podcast called The Rewatchables. We have been doing it really since 2017. It started with how much we love the movie Heat. We decided to structure a whole podcast with categories: most rewatchable scene, who won the movie, Apex Mountain, what age the best. But here's the thing. If you want the full archive, you can hear them only on Spotify, for free, by the way. So make sure to follow The Rewatchables on Spotify.
Welcome back. Today, Meryl is telling me all about pit bulls. We've just found out that when you look at the best science, it doesn't look like pit bulls are more aggressive towards people. Is that fair, Meryl?
Yeah, we don't have great evidence for that.
Excellent.
But the next thing that I want to tell you about is this idea that it's not that pit bulls are more likely to bite you, but that when they do bite, they're more likely to cause a lot of damage. You hear this in news reports that make it sound like pit bulls have these ultra-powerful jaws.
Police say the dog latched onto the 75-year-old victim's arm and refused to release. Animal control staff tried to intervene, but couldn't get the dog to stop.
And I've seen a bunch of stories like this. They'll talk about how pit bulls will latch onto someone and won't let go. People in these situations will sometimes stab the pit bulls to try to get them off because they can't figure out any other way to stop the attack.
Well, tonight, one family member stabbed the pit bull to death right here in their front yard after a vicious attack.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
Okay, so is there any evidence that a pit bull's jaw is any stronger or bite is any nastier than other dogs?
Yeah, I wanted to know this too. So I talked to Anthony Harrell. He's a researcher at the National History Museum in Paris. Could you list off all the animals that you've measured bite force in?
I've measured bite forces in over 500 species of animals.
Oh my god!
So it's kind of hard to list them all. But we've worked on fish, we've worked on birds, turtles, lizards, snakes, mammals, obviously.
Oh, I am so excited about this. I love a good bite force study.
And yeah, this is what he does. He makes these bite force measurements. He has been bit himself a ton of times by all sorts of animals. What do you think was the animal that gave him the worst bite?
Oh gosh, he said 500 that he'd studied. I bet it's something weird like a turtle or something.
Yeah, actually, it's pretty close. He said it was a horned frog just because it was so surprising. He didn't see it coming. But back to the dogs. So Anthony wanted to see whether some dogs have a stronger bite force than others. So he got 47 dog cadavers from vets, where the owners agreed to donate their dogs' bodies. And for Anthony, this was pretty exciting.
I mean, as an anatomist, I really enjoy doing dissections because you can really get to the nuts and bolts of how the system works. We take out muscle by muscle. We weigh the muscles, we measure the lengths.
So they dissected all sorts of dogs, like a Doberman, a Husky, a Toy Spaniel, and a Pit Bull. And then they measured a bunch of stuff like the muscles around their jaws and the shape of their skulls. They threw all of this data into a model to predict bite force. But to see if that model was accurate, they needed to get some dogs that were alive. So they got some dogs that were trained to bite on command.
Where do you find dogs that can bite on command? Is that a thing dogs can do?
Some of them, yeah. So there's actually this whole competition where people train their dogs to be really good guard dogs. And so as part of that, they have to bite people. And so Anthony basically borrowed some of these dogs to measure their bite force. If you want to see what the study looks like, just click on this link. Ooh, Anthony's the one in the back.
Oh, nice. So they just like, bite, go bite.
Yeah, they're saying, here you go, in French.
What's that thing the dog's biting?
So they have the dog bite this thing that sort of looked like an oven mitt to me, but inside of that oven mitt thing is a special device that can actually measure how strongly the dog is biting. It uses a crystal.
Oh, fancy.
Yeah.
It's called a piezoelectric crystal.
Huh.
And so this crystal has the unique opportunity that as you deform it, so if you push on it, it sends out a current. And the more you deform it, the higher the current.
So they combine the data from those dissections with the data from the live dogs to find out which dogs have the strongest bites.
Aha! So what did they find?
Let's start at the bottom with the dogs that have the weakest bites. So the two dogs in Anthony's study with the weakest bites were a Chihuahua and a Toy Spaniel.
Obviously, like the bigger the dog, the harder it's going to bite. It makes a lot of sense. A bigger animal will have more muscle. As you have more muscle, you can bite harder.
Yeah, so that was one big pattern. The smaller the dog, the weaker the bite.
They're meaner, but they nibble on you. It's not a big deal if they bite.
Yeah, it kind of balances out nicely that way, right?
Okay, all right.
And then that was one pattern. Another pattern that he found had to do with the shape of the head. So the dogs with the long, skinny heads, like greyhounds, had weaker bites. And so what were the dogs with the strongest bites then?
And so the dogs with the strongest bites are typically these breeds that you can think of that have these really wide, bulky heads. This provides lots of space for the jaw muscles, and those are the dogs that actually can bite quite hard. So basically you can think of Rottweilers, you can think of like pit bulls, you can think of all of these kind of breeds, Mastiffs, that are bred for actually fighting, for biting, for defense.
Yep. The pit bull that they looked at was at the top of the charts, along with some other of these big fat-headed dogs like the Rottweilers and a Mastiff.
Okay. So this is very much a science point in favor of those who think pit bulls are inherently more dangerous.
Yeah, totally. And this might explain why, if you look at people who need to go to the hospital from dog bites, the people who got bit by pit bulls often have worse injuries compared to people who got bit by other dogs.
Oh, this feels like a very big point in the favor of the...
Absolutely.
No pity for the pity party.
Yeah. Pit bulls can give some nasty bites, along with a bunch of other fat-headed dogs.
Yes, that don't have such terrible reputations.
Yeah, like they're part of this kind of group of dogs that are capable of inflicting a lot of damage. But the science doesn't back up all of those stereotypes about pit bulls. Like that idea that they can like latch on to their victims for a lot longer than other dogs. I asked Anthony about that idea.
There is no data out there in the literature where people have tested the amount of time a dog can hold on and produce a certain amount of bite force. And I would expect that dogs like fox terriers and these kind of breeds, that they would also be just as good at holding on to an object.
And Anthony doesn't buy that pit bulls deserve this reputation that they have when a lot of other dogs have strong bites too.
Pit bulls don't really stand out relative to other wide-headed dogs. Some are bigger than others, so the bigger they are, the harder they bite. So in absolute terms, a Rottweiler will bite harder than a pit bull because it's a bigger dog. And I think the biggest misunderstanding is that just because a dog can bite hard, that it's going to be aggressive. Absolutely not true. So intrinsically, a pit bull can be just as sweet as any other dogs.
Right. We tend to think of aggression in a dog and its bite force as the same thing. But he's saying they're actually separate traits.
Yeah. And Anthony thinks that when it comes to dog bites, it's not actually about the dog breeds at all.
It's not the dogs that are the problem. It's the dog owners that really are the problem.
Okay, this is something we haven't talked about yet. This idea that it's not the dog, it's the dog owner.
Yeah, and there is some evidence for this. So, like, one study looked at over 200 dog bite fatalities from across 10 years, and they found that 76% of the time, the dogs that killed someone were, quote, kept isolated from regular positive human interactions, unquote. I talked to Anna McNeil about this, and she said to picture a dog that's, like, always tied up outside.
They've perhaps spent their life in a yard or on a chain. They spend a lot of time barking at fences. They're not properly socialized.
But, you know, a lot of this could also just be miscommunication. Like, we're two different species, and sometimes it's not always intuitive to read what a dog is feeling.
Right.
And the experts think that one thing that could help all of this is if we got better at reading dog behavior. Okay, so in a lot of the news stories about dog attacks, the owners will say, like, oh, my dog bit someone and it was completely out of nowhere. But Anna's skeptical about this because what she's seen a lot of the time is that people just don't know what the warning signs look like that come out, like, before the dog actually bites.
Owners don't always notice the signs that you need to be noticing, so they might say this was completely unprovoked. This dog has never acted like this before. But to anyone who really knows dog behavior, the dog had been warning for a long time and was giving fair warnings.
So, yeah, experts told me that often, like, if a dog is feeling threatened, it'll give, like, a hard stare or a growl, or it'll, like, show its teeth a little before actually biting someone. And it's, like, our job as dog owners to pay attention and then intervene before that leads to a bite. But one group of people that's really bad at looking for these warning signs is kids. Like, not by their own fault, like, they're just, like, kind of young and stupid. But, like, a lot of kids do get bit by dogs. Researchers think that maybe a lot of these bites are preventable if we teach kids better, like, how to behave around dogs. Like, don't pull on dogs' ears, don't run up to a dog you don't know, and stare at it in the eyes.
Don't stare at it in the eyes? I didn't know. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's common sense to some people, and other
thanks.
Common sense is not.
No, but even for me,
anymore.
I didn't know some of these things. Like, I mentioned.
What are the other things?
So, like, if a dog chases you, what would you do? Like, a scary dog is running after you.
Stop, right? I think I would stop.
That's right, yeah.
Is that right? Are you supposed to stop? But that feels stupid.
It feels kind of counterintuitive. Like, I think I might want to run away as fast as I can. But no, apparently the answer is don't run away, don't scream, just be quiet and stay still, and usually the dogs go away. And so the science shows that teaching all this stuff to kids can change their behavior when they're around dogs.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And not just, what did you call them? Stupid little kids, but stupid little adults too.
Yeah. Can help us all.
So to bring this back to Penny, your genetically designed
monster.
A monster. Yeah, your genetically designed monster.
How are you feeling about Penny now?
On the one hand, I'm not worried about her, like, breed mixture being this big red flag that makes her more dangerous than other dog breeds. But it's also true that, like, technically any dog could snap at any moment, and she's a large dog with a big, strong jaw. And now, like, I'm more on the lookout for, like, those warning signs and really reading her behavior so that I can step in as soon as there's, like, any little sign that she might be feeling threatened.
Well, Meryl, you worked like a dog on this episode. You hounded the research. You powered at it like a Rhodesian Ridgeback after a lion.
Wow.
And now you get a treat.
Did I get my treat now?
Thanks, Meryl.
Thanks, Wendy.
That's Science Versus. And how many citations in this week's episode?
Oh, citations. There are 80 citations in this week's episode.
80 citations. Excellent. And if people want to find them, where should they go?
They can go to our show notes and then follow the links to the transcript.
Next week on the show is ketamine.
It feels like it's this, like, magical new drug for depression. But I'm still...
I'm kind of going backwards through the episodes, but it's all right.
Hello.
Hey, Wendy. Shall we go up?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. Here we go. Come with me.
I'm at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, Australia, with Dr. Fernando Gordillo Altamirano, and we're headed to a research lab attached to the hospital.
This is my first lab tour post-COVID.
Oh, really?
I wonder if the beakers still look the same.
They look exactly the same. They haven't changed.
At first, this looks like any other lab. You know the drill, test tubes, white walls, lab coats. But then Fernando walks me to a room filled with big freezers. And in here, there's something that you don't see in every lab.
What is inside these freezers?
Superbugs.
Superbugs. Bacteria that can't be killed by some of our strongest antibiotics. And I'm in a room filled with them.
Whoa! And I'm not wearing a mask!
Well, they are all frozen. They are technically harmless in their current state.
Technically harmless!
Fernando carefully opens the freezer door and white fog snakes out. It looks like we're in Penguin's lair, you know, from Batman. When the fog clears, I can see shelves filled with thousands of vials.
Okay.
So this is like Superbug Central.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet. And today we're pitting facts against infections as we look at superbugs. Okay, so you know how Fernando just said that we were safe because the superbugs were contained and frozen? Well,
I just unfroze from our freezers that you just saw 4 of them.
What? It's like the scariest cooking show you've ever seen.
I'm looking at some of the deadliest bacteria in the world. And I know I'm making jokes, because that's kind of what I do. But looking down at these agar plates, it is freaky. I mean, just imagine getting an infection with one of these, a UTI or a nasty cough like pneumonia. Going to the doctor and having no little pill to make you feel better. One woman survived a suicide bombing in Brussels only to almost die because her wounds got infected with a superbug. In fact, the bacteria that almost killed her was the same species that I'm staring at right now.
The bugs have been recognized as the most dangerous ones in terms of antibiotic resistance. And when a patient gets infected by one of these bad guys, that patient is in serious trouble.
For years, we've been hearing about this problem, that our drugs aren't working as well as they used to. But recently, it feels like things have gotten out of hand. Because if you've been watching the news, it's not only that these bugs are super scary, but they're also everywhere. It's as if they're ready to infect us when we take the train.
On the underground, they found traces of 9 so-called superbugs, which are
Or eat a chicken burger.
Listen up. A recent study shows that nearly 80% of the meat in U.S. supermarkets contains antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Or even get cracked on by a seagull.
Researchers finding 1 in 5 seagulls carry superbugs resistant to antibiotics.
One headline screamed that if we don't do something soon, we're headed towards an impending superbug apocalypse. The end to modern medicine as we know it. So today on the show, is this for real? Are superbugs really everywhere? And what are scientists doing about all this? Because it turns out that here at this lab that I'm visiting, they're recruiting an unexpected soldier in this fight. With the help of perhaps my turds.
You're doing a good deed for the patients here, 100%.
When it comes to superbugs, a lot of people are saying that we live in
Superbug Central.
But then there's science. Science versus Superbugs is coming up.
This episode is brought to you by delicious Bear Snacks. Between cryotherapy, goat yoga, and smoothies made with things you can't even pronounce, wellness can feel a bit complicated. But there's a simpler way to wellness. Bear Snacks. They're a tasty, crunchy snack made simply of apples. With Bear Snacks, less is more. Buy Bear Snacks now at most grocery retailers nationwide.
Welcome back. Today, we're on the hunt for superbugs, bacteria that have learned to fight off our antibiotics. And we're asking, how bad is this? And to get to the bottom of that, we first want to know where these bugs are hiding. Because, as you just heard in the news, it seems like they're everywhere. Is that true? To find out, we called up Ed Farl, a professor at the University of Bath in the UK, whose team recently went searching for superbugs in a city called Pavia. Here's Ed.
It's beautiful. It's very typically Italian.
Pavia is in northern Italy. Picture it. Cobblestone streets, great food. In fact, he told me that this is the region where Gorgonzola is made.
I don't know. What more can I say about Pavia? I recommend it.
And so, in this land of cheese, Ed got 3 very fastidious research assistants to go searching for superbugs, taking swabs all over the city. And I mean, all over.
Swings and benches, samples from ATM machines, buses. They even sampled the holy water in the cathedral.
Oh, okay. The holy water? Like they snuck into the cathedral with a little swabber?
Yeah, they took a little sample of that.
And they went all over the hospitals too, sampling patients and surfaces. And then they went out of the city and onto the surrounding farms, to the pigs, chickens, and cows.
And how did you take the samples from the cows?
So rectal swabs, mostly.
Up the butt?
Up the butt, yeah.
I have a little game. I try and make every academic say up the butt at least once during our interview.
Yeah, okay. That's fine. I'm happy with that.
Then they all got busy at the lab, genetically sequencing the samples, more than 3,000 of them. And basically, Ed and his team wanted to know, where are the superbugs? And for the real nerds out there, Ed was looking for superbugs within the genus Klebsiella. Okay, so first, some good news. The holy water?
Came up negative, I'm pleased to say. So the good people of Pavia can relax that that's fine.
But then, the bad news. They found that around the town and on the farms, there were a lot of bacteria that had resistance to some antibiotics. Tricks up their sleeves to fend off drugs like penicillin or streptomycin. These were found in the soil, on poultry, dogs, cats.
So you see those basically everywhere. They're everywhere. I mean, they're out of the box now. So, I mean, just think of it as a type of pollution, really.
And it turns out that this isn't just happening in beautiful Pavia. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria really have been found all over the place. Yes, in subways, sausages, and seagulls. But also hitching a ride on tiny pieces of plastic in the ocean. They've been found in the Arctic, and something that really blew my mind, they've even been found in an isolated cave in New Mexico that's 1,000 feet underground.
Not surprising.
So how the hell did this happen? I talked about this with Dr. Fernando Gordillo Altamirano. He's the guy that showed us around the superbug freezer. And Fernando told me that this all started a very, very, very long time ago.
Antibiotic resistance is not man-made, right? It is a phenomenon that occurs naturally.
Bacteria started learning tricks to outsmart antibiotics way before we started popping them for our infections. And that's because bacteria have always had enemies, things in nature, like fungi, that wanted to kill them. And so the fungi, they had their own antibiotics, chemicals to destroy bacteria. In fact, we got penicillin from fungus. Thanks. So this all means that from a bacteria's perspective, they need to come up with ways to fight back. And they've been doing this for thousands of years. I mean, literally, we have evidence in the permafrost that bacteria had this superpower 30,000 years ago. So, this is one reason why we're seeing antibiotic-resistant bacteria all over the place. Because they've been doing this for ages.
Where humans accelerate this process is when we start introducing antibiotics into the environment. And we are using on a massive scale.
Around the world, we take billions of antibiotics each year, and it's only growing. We give a ton to our livestock too, not just to kill disease, but to make our animals grow faster. And each time we use antibiotics, we put bacteria in this very clear position. Evolve some way to get around it, or die. And so, bacteria have been evolving. And by the way, this isn't just happening in bacteria. Ever since we started using antifungals, we've also been seeing more resistance with fungal infections. But of course, you guys all know that thanks to that HBO doco, The Last of Us. Okay, but back to bacteria. So now these bugs have all these tricks to outsmart our drugs. Like, for example, some of them make enzymes that chew up our antibiotics. And the way that these tricks have spread so quickly is partly because once a bacteria learns a new trick, they can share it with their friends. And one of the ways they do that is through this process called conjugation.
And boy, is it interesting.
Tina Joshi at the University of Plymouth in the UK.
It sounds very sexy because like conjugation sounds.
It is like bacterial sex. When I teach about it, I'd say it's bacterial sex, right? So
it's bacterial sex.
It literally is.
When bacteria learn a new trick to fight off our antibiotics, it might start by just a random mutation in their genetics. One little letter in their DNA flips, and this gives them an advantage. Conjugation is the process where some bacteria can then share those genes. And here's how it works. So picture it. A bacteria is swimming about, and then this appendage called a pilus emerges from the bacteria.
Like a stick, a stick that comes out of it, and it's like a thin strand that's coming out, like a little thin hair almost. And that's really biologically incorrect. So sorry for everyone who's a scientist listening, but it's a bit like a hair moving through.
The pilus of the superbug finds a friendly bacteria and attaches on. And meanwhile, the superbug has copied part of its DNA, including the part that helped it fight off our antibiotics. So then, what happens is that the superbug DNA moves through the pilus and into the friendly bacteria. So that ultimately, where we had one superbug, now we have two. And this bacterial sex, it can happen between different species. In fact, there was this case report of a guy who had a really scary superbug infection that was shrugging off our most powerful antibiotics. Doctors were freaking out. Anyway, the infection was caused by a bacteria called Klebsiella. But inside this guy, researchers saw that the superbug gene had already jumped into an E. coli. And that superbug gene, it's since been found all over the world in more than a dozen different species. And the thing that I'd never thought about is that all this bacterial sex, it isn't happening at a seedy motel down the road.
It's going on inside us. All the time, yeah. All the time inside us. That gene swapping between bacteria is always happening.
Because wherever there are bacteria, there is bacterial sex. And in just one bout of bacterial bonking, they'll often pass on not just one trick to fend off our antibiotics, but a whole superbug goodie bag.
And the spread is just phenomenal, and we can't control it. I mean, we can't control evolution. We might think we can, and we might think we're the most evolved species in the universe, but we cannot control bacterial evolution. All we can do is just look and think, oh my God. Sorry, I don't want it to be scary.
But it does sound scary. These bacteria are doing all this hanky-panky all over the place, sharing resistance to our antibiotics, and they've been found all over the world doing this. Our next question is, I don't know, why aren't we all dead? Well, the thing is that even though these bacteria are special, they're not super in every single way. Like, they're not necessarily nastier or more contagious than regular bacteria. So a lot of the time, our immune system can actually keep them in check. In fact, what we're learning is that you can even be carrying a superbug, like in your belly, and not even know it. One study looked at more than 1,000 poo samples and found that 9% of the turds had antibiotic-resistant E. coli in them. I asked Ed about this, the guy whose team was snooping around the holy water in Pavia.
I think we assume that if a bug has a resistance to antibiotics or even multiple resistances, that it is inherently dangerous and nasty. But actually, it could just sit in your gut happily and not cause any disease. Those are two separate things.
They're very much separate things, yes. So a superbug isn't any more likely to cause disease. It's just that if it does, it's harder to treat.
But where superbugs do become a real problem is in hospitals. And that's partly because you have people who are already sick, whose immune systems might be a little weak, and it's easier for any kind of bacteria, super or not, to take hold. And in fact, hospitals are a big superbug problem for another reason, because it's also where you find the scariest of the superbugs. Okay, so the bacteria that we're finding on our trains and meat, while they might be resistant to some antibiotics, we still have ways of killing them. Even MRSA, which you hear about people getting in locker rooms. While the infections can be nasty, we haven't completely run out of ways to kill that bacteria. So while these bugs are bad news, they're not the worst news. The bacteria that are resistant to basically all the antibiotics we have, let's call them super bugs. You're most likely to run into those in one place, and that's hospitals.
Super bugs, they haven't made it out of the hospitals at all, as far as we could tell.
That's right. When Ed's team ransacked Pavia for them, these super bugs were only in the hospitals. Other studies around the world mostly find the same thing, that hospitals are ground zero for this. And it makes sense that super bugs, the bacteria that we're really struggling to treat, that they would thrive in hospitals, because that is where we use a ton of different antibiotics. Now, it is really hard to put numbers around your risk of getting infected by a superbug or a superbug in a hospital. If you're in a richer country, the risk is still fairly low. So, for example, in the US, about 3% of patients get some kind of infection while they're in hospital. And depending on the type of infection, a fairly small chunk of those are superbugs. But away from rich countries, this can be a lot worse. So one study out of Rwanda found that more than 3 out of 4 hospital infections were superbugs. In Ukraine, before the war, it was even worse. It's all enough to freak out Fernando.
I think that any time in the past 5 years since I've been working on superbugs and antibiotic resistance, anytime a loved one is hospitalized for, any reason, minor surgery or anything like that, I immediately get paranoid. Oh my God, I don't want them to get an infection. And it is nerve-wracking.
I mean, the whole thing is really scary.
He's dead again.
We're in this race against the bacteria, and it feels like generally we're losing that race.
And if we do lose, we are really screwed. Zooming out to all superbugs here, and not just the super ones, Already, around 50,000 people in the US are dying each year from them. And worldwide, it's estimated that in 2019, around 1.3 million people died of a superbug infection, meaning that these bacteria killed more people that year than AIDS and malaria combined. And you know, this isn't just about some nasty cut on your leg. If you've ever had surgery, cancer treatment, a C-section, your wisdom teeth taken out, all of this kind of becomes a roll of the dice if we don't have antibiotics to deal with infections. Here's Tina.
The impacts are just colossal. You know, we have this thing where we just turn to antibiotics as being, right, they're always there. And what we're saying now is they're not going to always be there. So what do we do next?
What is the biggest misconception that people have about superbugs?
The scientists will solve it. It'll get solved. You know what? We don't need to worry. They'll sort it out.
Yeah.
Will you? Coming up after the break, my poo to the rescue?
This episode is brought to you by Capital One. With one of the best savings rates in America, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than deciding to listen to another episode of your favorite podcast. And with no fees or minimums on checking and savings accounts, is it even a decision? Get started today. It only takes about 5 minutes to open an account with Capital One, and there's no minimum to open and keep your account. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank. Capital One N.A. Member FDIC.
Welcome back. Today we are looking at the battle between bacteria and us. So far, it's been looking like the bugs are winning. But now, we're going to see what scientists are doing to fight back. So we're going to take a deep dive into one of the buzziest ways of tackling this superbug problem. And this is what we're doing. Using viruses to kill superbugs. They're called phages. And Fernando, who is at the forefront of this research, he knows how it sounds.
But aren't viruses supposed to be bad? Here's the catch. So phages do not harm humans. They cannot infect human cells. Instead, phages only infect and then kill bacterial cells.
And so going back to my ancient Greek, phage is to eat. Phage means to eat. So are these viruses eating the bacteria? No, they're so little. They can like nibble on them.
They aren't eating the bacteria. They are killing them in a way cooler way, in my opinion. So phages, yeah, they are tiny. They are almost 100 times smaller than bacteria, right? And when you look at them, they look so cool. They look like an alien spaceship, right? So they have this head that is like a hexagonal or polygonal head, and then they have this thin neck and tail, and then at the end of the tail, they have these tiny little legs, right?
Fernando tells me that these viruses use those tiny little legs to sense their environment, and they're hunting for one thing: bacteria. Once they recognize one they like, they latch onto it, inject their genetic material inside it, and then they
hijack the bacteria. They tell the bacteria, you know what? You are going to stop doing what you were normally doing. You're only going to produce baby phages, baby viruses.
They create heaps of these baby viruses inside the bacterial cell. And eventually, those babies are ready to bust out.
Boom, it explodes. So tens, sometimes hundreds of these tiny viruses are liberated from the exploding bacterial cell, and they will go on to infect the neighboring bacterial cells. So yeah, they are not eating the bacteria per se. They are making it explode with hundreds of tiny baby viruses, which is perhaps a little bit more difficult to explain, but it is way, way cooler.
So far, so good. Phages are viruses that make superbugs go
boom.
And this might sound like sci-fi, but it isn't theoretical. We are doing all this in patients now. It's actually Fernando's job to find a phage that can be used to kill a patient's superbug infection. But first, he has to find the right phage. Because these phages, they can be really picky. Often one kind of phage will only infect one type of bug, say an E. coli. So when Fernando has a patient that is sick with a superbug, he's got to find the right assassin for the job. Where does he start?
Sewage.
So sewage like Melbourne sewage.
As in Melbourne sewage.
Fernando opens the door to a dark room. Ooh, okay, we're going into the cold room now. Ooh, it is chilly. And he shows me his pride and joy.
The sewage sample that I prepared for you.
No one's ever said that to me.
I prepared with a lot of love some sewage for you, Wendy, and for the whole team. So I hope you appreciate it.
By the time I see it, there's no chunks in it, let's say. It kind of looks like an olive martini.
Yeah.
Like a very dirty martini, yeah.
And the reason that Fernando is looking for phages inside this very dirty martini is because wherever there is poo, there is bacteria living in it. And where bacteria live, there tends to be viruses that want to prey on that bacteria. So when Fernando has a patient who's sick, infected with a superbug, what he's hoping is that someone in Melbourne will be carrying that specific phage.
Oh,
so
interesting.
then he can bottle it up and use it for his patients. And Fernando doesn't just go looking for phages in our crap, but also in water that's all over the place.
So my partner thinks that I have this weird obsession with dirty water because every time we come across, a puddle, a pond, something that looks gross and has water in it, I think, ooh, I bet I could get some really cool phages out of this. He thinks it's weird. He thinks it's completely weird. But yeah, I guess it's one of my quirks now.
Once he gets that dirty water to see if there's any superbug killing phages inside it, basically he'll mix a dash of superbug with a sprinkling of dirty sewage water, let it incubate, put it on an agar plate, bada bing, bada boom. He passes me a plate. Okay.
What do you see?
Oh gosh. I guess I see like little bubbles.
They are like tiny little pinpricks. So what you're seeing there is bacterial death. There's nothing growing there. We just see a bacterial graveyard.
Really?
So yeah, really cool.
Seeing this bacterial graveyard is the moment Fernando thinks he's found a killer phage. And from here, him and his team will purify and test it, bottle it up, and put it in a vial, ready for a patient. And he's been doing this over and over again, building up what he calls a phage library. Now that I've moved to Melbourne, is possible that, my crap helped create this phage library. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I feel so good.
You're doing your a good deed, 100%.
So this is all very exciting. My crap, saving lives. With phages, have you solved the superbug crisis?
I would love to say that I have, but no, absolutely not. By themselves, phages will not be able to solve this issue.
One of the reasons that phages won't get us out of this mess is because, like a man, a good phage can be hard to find. So, for example, Fernando told me about this one patient who had a superbug infection, and Fernando was searching for a phage that could kill it for months.
Getting negative result after negative result and after negative result, nothing was a hit. There were many times when I thought that it was pointless. And then there was one morning when I just opened the incubator door, took the plate out, and the moment I quickly glanced at the plate, I already saw, boom, that beautiful zone of clearing, and it's just the best feeling ever.
What did you do as soon as you saw it?
I just jumped and said, yes! So that was amazing. That was amazing, knowing that I had finally found a phage against this particular superbug.
Amazing, yes. But it's not practical to think that we could do this for everyone who gets some
weird superbug infection. And that's why Fernando is building that phage library, in the hopes that he won't have to sift through my crap for every single patient. But there is another problem here. The jury is actually still out on how well this treatment works. For now, it's only given to people who are really, really sick, kind of like a last resort. One analysis of 20 patients who had used phage therapy saw it was helping over half of them. The patient Fernando found that phage for, well, at first the treatment looked like it was going really well, but ultimately they died of other causes. And just quickly, there is one final wrinkle in this phage idea. You see, studies in rodents are showing that a very familiar problem may soon pop up.
Bacteria or superbugs can also become resistant to phage.
Yeah, they're not taking this lying down, this phage attack.
They will come up with ways to attack back.
No.
So it's this arms race between bacteria and phages.
Researchers are trying to get around this by giving antibiotics and phages to patients, because studies have found that this can help. Now, none of this means that phage therapy is a bad idea. You know, scientists are using this all around the world to save people's lives. But it does mean that this shiny technology, it's not a silver bullet. And it's not a substitute for all those ideas that you might have been hearing about for ages to help us solve this superbug crisis. Like, we still need new antibiotics, ones that bacteria aren't resistant to yet. And meanwhile, Big Pharma has been pulling out of this space because it's not worth it for them to make antibiotics. That's for a lot of reasons, but one is that we'd only use these drugs to treat a disease quickly, rather than, say, a heart disease drug that you'd be popping for years.
Yeah.
And as for the antibiotics that we do have, we've got to cool our jets with them. In 2019, the CDC estimated that almost a third of the antibiotics prescribed by US doctors' offices and emergency departments were unnecessary. A third.
Oh,
And
shocking.
through the pandemic, this got even worse. Unnecessary antibiotic prescriptions jumped. And now, superbug infections are on the rise too.
We can try to keep coming up with new therapies or new solutions for the infections that are already happening, but the idea is to stop this evolution, this process from happening in the first place. So we don't want to focus too much on the Band-Aid. We really need to focus on what is causing the wound in the first place. So we need to stop taking antibiotics if we don't need them. Doctors, clinicians only prescribe antibiotics when you are sure that patients need them. So let's be rational about our use of antibiotics in general.
If I was into poetry, I would be clicking you right now, but I really can't get away with that stuff.
That's Science Versus.
Hey.
Hi, Joel Werner, our new supervising producer here at Science Versus.
Hey, Wendy. Very stoked to be on the team. It's great to do my first citations chat.
You've won awards, you've done all the things, but have you had a citations chat, Joel?
All of those moments have been building to this particular moment where I get to reveal the number of citations in this week's Science Versus episode. Should I reach for the envelope? All right, so can I just say now?
Yeah.
I haven't done this before. I'm not very good at it. This week on the show, we had 138 citations.
138. And if people want to see these citations, where should they go?
They should click on the link in the show notes. That will take them to the transcript where it's all laid out for them. It's very easy.
It's very easy, yes. And while you are there, listener, looking at the show notes or looking at your podcast app, you should give us a review, a 5-star review. Next week, we have our episode on pit bulls, asking, are they dangerous dogs that should be banned or misunderstood cuddly pets?
This one surprised me. I'm going to say I came into this episode with some strongly held beliefs about pit bulls, but they've been shaken up a bit.
Whoa. Thanks so much, Joel.
Thanks, Wendy.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.
This episode was produced by me, Wendy Zuckerman, with help from Joel Werner, Rose Rimler, Meryl Horn, Ari Natovich, and Michelle Dang. We're edited by Blythe Terrell. Gimlet's managing director is Nicole Beamsteyer-Bohr. Fact-checking by Carmen Dral. Mix and sound design by Catherine Anderson. Music written by Bobby Lord, Emma Munger, So Wiley, and Bhumi Hidaka. Thanks to all of the researchers we spoke to for this episode, including Professor Evgeny Sokorienko, Professor Anton Peleg, Professor John Iredell, Dr. Alejandro Chavez, Dr. Branwen Morgan, Professor Asad Khan, Dr. Ramanan
Go to the next one and see hangovers, what really helps. This would be interesting.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet. Today, we're pitting facts against feeling like a bag of dicks. As we look at hangovers, is there anything you can do to stop them?
Yeah, don't drink.
Last week, we took a deep dive into whether a cheeky glass of beer or wine is healthy. And new research is telling us no. It was sad news. And when our producer, Ari Natovich, headed to Bourbon Street in New Orleans, this is Party Central, it seemed like quite a few people were clearly drowning their sorrows. And we wanted to know, when the hangovers kicked in the next day, what were people going to do? And basically everyone had a go-to. One big thing we heard over and over again, drinking water.
Water.
Some damn water. Shit. Go to the hospital, get that IV.
A lot of water.
You need to get hydrated.
Some people were taking it a step further and going for water that was supercharged with electrolytes.
You get a bottle of Pedialyte and you chug that shit before you go to bed. That's the only thing you can do to make yourself feel better.
Some were going to close their eyes and hope for the best.
Probably sleep.
Just sleep.
While others had plans for a big breakfast when they got up.
Bacon, egg, and cheese helps the hangover. Grease, lots of grease.
So today, we're putting our hangover cures to the ultimate test.
Make a bad situation
and bottom line,
worse.
we are going to find out if there's anything you can do to cure a hangover. Because when it comes to hangovers, there's a lot of...
Chug that shit before you go to bed.
But then there's science.
Oh, fuck.
Science versus hangovers is coming up just after the break. Welcome back. Today, we are taking a shot at finding an actual hangover cure. Does it exist? And to find out, we're going 15,000 kilometers away from Bourbon Street.
Can I just get a lager, please?
To a pub in Melbourne, Australia.
That is a perfect pour, by the way.
I'm here with Professor Andrew Scully.
I will have a beer.
He got a Pepsi.
Pepsi Max?
Yeah.
Andrew works in industry and is affiliated with Monash and Swinburne universities in Melbourne. And one of the things that Andrew studies is hangovers. He's written a bunch on the topic and even puts his body on the line for his craft.
We occasionally road test some of the purported hangover cures, which often involves drinking a bottle of a big, dirty red wine and seeing if there's any effect of the putative hangover cures.
Amazing.
I mean, who knows? You've got to suffer for science sometimes.
And the first potential hangover cure that we're going to talk to Andrew about is something we heard a ton of on Bourbon Street: drinking water. And this idea, it could make a lot of sense because alcohol is a diuretic, which means it makes you
pee. So you pee out
Amino
more
acids.
water than you would normally do so.
Now, if you're peeing out a ton of water, it stands to reason that you might be dehydrated.
Not just plain
which
water.
We know when you get really, really dehydrated, you can get headaches and feel awful. And the thing is, so many articles that quote scientists talk about dehydration as a big reason for hangovers. You'll hear sciencey sounding people all over the place saying this.
We're busting a few hangover myths
Amino
now with
acids have
science
always
journalist
worked
Wendy
for me.
Zuckerman. Let's make a welcome.
Including me. Almost 10 years ago, this is what I said on national Australian television about what happens when you drink alcohol.
So it really makes us pee a lot. And that means that when we wake up in the morning, we're often incredibly dehydrated. So what is the best thing you can do?
Okay, so was I right? Are hangovers caused by dehydration, and will guzzling down water fix you right up? It's time for Science versus Wendy. I need a drink. So back when I did that interview, that is what the science was suggesting. But since then, we've got more data, and things have gotten pretty muddy.
It's not straightforward, yeah.
Okay, interesting. So, studies find that when you drink a lot of booze, like say 6 drinks, as they measured in one study, you do pee more than you would if you were drinking, say, juice. About half a litre or a pint glass more, they found. The question is, though, is that enough to dehydrate you? And we actually couldn't find any studies that had checked whether people were technically dehydrated after a night of drinking. What we do have, though, are studies that have looked at whether drinking more water makes people's hangovers better. And generally, these studies find that it doesn't. Now, if you're vomiting, this is a bit different. That will make you lose a ton of fluids, and we know after vomiting, water is a good idea. But ultimately, when it comes to hangovers, a big review paper from 2019 found that while lots of people think dehydration is the main cause of hangovers, not mentioning any names, the research, quote, suggests otherwise, end quote. I talked to Andrew about this. Once you have a hangover, does drinking water take away the hangover?
No, it doesn't really seem to alleviate
Doesn't
hangover
do
symptoms,
anything.
despite what people say.
That's so disappointing.
Yeah.
For everyone who's downed glass after glass of water while being hungover and found it didn't really help, now you know why.
You're
And to
just
go
gonna
back
drink
to
water,
my TV
put
advice, that drinking water was
either
the key.
Well, Wendy, next time we have our head in the toilet, we'll be thinking of you and your advice.
The overconfidence of youth. Okay, moving on. Next up, what about electrolytes? These are things like sodium, potassium, and magnesium. And the whole idea with downing Gatorade or little sachets filled with electrolytes is that they're going to help you rehydrate. Now again, if you're vomiting, then yes, electrolytes with some water is a good idea. But if your head isn't in the toilet, the research we have doesn't suggest that electrolytes play any special role in hangovers. Like one study from the 1970s got about 20 students really drunk, measured their sodium, potassium levels, and found no link between how bad their hangovers were and whether they were low on any electrolytes. So Andrew says this idea of chugging electrolytes?
But it just doesn't hold up to any scrutiny. So I haven't seen any evidence at all to back that up.
Do you think that people sometimes don't believe when you tell them it's not about dehydration, it's not about electrolytes? These are just such firmly held beliefs. Do you ever have students just
fucking
go,
science,
no,
it doesn't...
I swear by it.
I think there are people who genuinely believe that it works for them. But yeah, the plural of anecdote isn't evidence.
Ooh, tough talk from Andrew.
Oh, tough pill to swallow.
Next up, what about just sleeping? Does that help? Lab studies have found that after just one night of crappy sleep, it can turn you into a couple of the 7 dwarves. Sleepy, duh, but also dopey and grumpy. We know sleep is important. And research has also found over and over again that alcohol affects our sleep. Or as Andrew says,
alcohol itself really screws with your sleep architecture, which seems to be very important in hangover severity.
So if people just aren't sleeping properly the night before, a lot of those symptoms you also see, crankiness.
Exactly. All sorts of cognitive problems, just screwed up by poor sleep.
Curiously, in studies that have looked at how alcohol affects our sleep, they found that there are some lucky people who tend to sleep pretty well despite drinking a bunch of booze. And they also tend to get less hungover. The problem is, this is kind of beyond our control, right? Like,
for me, I sleep terribly after a grog-fueled night. So trying to sleep is hardly a cure. Okay, what about a humble pill, like an aspirin or ibuprofen? And you might be like, sure, for my headache, right? But actually, this could also help for a reason that came as a real surprise to us on the Science Versus team. Okay, so when you drink, the alcohol in your body gets broken down into toxins.
Metabolization.
And it's looking like, as a response to those toxins, your immune system kicks in, creating inflammation. One review paper said that alcohol can profoundly affect inflammation. So, for example, your immune cells spit out these things called cytokines to start cleaning up the mess that all that whiskey has made in your body. And scientists can actually see that after we booze up, various cytokine levels can go up. And just generally speaking, there's evidence that inflammation can cause stuff like
nausea, fatigue, brain fog feelings.
So, while researchers are still working all this out, a lot of them in this space, including Andrew, now think that inflammation might be a key part of why we get hangovers. You can kind of think about it like you've put all of these toxins into your body and now your immune system is scrambling to fix it all up. And this is why perhaps tweaking that response with a cheeky anti-inflammatory might help your hangover. And indeed, one study found that giving people a drug like this before and after a whole bunch of drinking, it did make their hangovers a little better the next day. Be careful though, because taking a bunch of anti-inflammatories can up your risk of intestinal bleeding. And the science isn't so rock solid on this. I mean, when I asked Andrew what he might take for a hangover, he was pretty dithery on this one.
Possibly some, I might look at an anti-inflammatory would be the thing.
Okay, so it turns out that in the world of hangovers, the best science we have here is not on curing one once you're already holding your vom bag, but it's about winding back the clock on your night of booze and preventing the hangover in the first place. For this, don't waste your time worrying about drinking beer before wine. A study actually tested whether the order of those drinks matters, and it doesn't.
So beer before wine is fine. I can't remember which way around it goes.
But either way, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, yes.
But instead, before you start ordering your drinks, flip to the food menu. Okay, so on Bourbon Street, people were thinking about what they were going to gobble up the next morning as a hangover cure.
Greasy food.
Why does greasy food work?
Because it absorbs all the
toxins in your body.
It absorbs all the science terms that you guys are probably looking for.
Truth is, I'm not looking for some sciencey terms.
I'm just looking for some garbage. Come on.
And we don't actually have any good research showing that what you eat after you're blitzed matters, whether it's greasy or not. But to find out if eating beforehand helps, one study gave 10 men a hefty meal of 2 cheese sandwiches, an egg, yogurt, coffee, and OJ, and then followed it up with some alcohol. And they found that after the men ate, their peak alcohol levels were around 35% lower compared to when they drank on an empty stomach. Other studies have found this kind of thing too. And we know that having less alcohol in your blood drops the chance that you'll have a nasty hangover.
Absolutely, yeah. Drinking on an empty stomach is pretty disastrous for intoxication and hangover.
And so that would suggest you need to have your stomach full before you start eating alcohol.
Exactly.
What we're learning is that hangovers are this complicated
Doesn't mean fucking
thing
go to McDonald's
where your body
and get...
is trying to deal with all that alcohol you've poured into it.
Fucking...
So I guess it's not surprising that there's no quick fix. Oh, well, I guess there is one. Number one way to prevent a hangover.
Don't drink
Just
alcohol.
don't do it.
Don't drink alcohol to excess.
Right, yes, you don't drink, you don't get a hangover. Cheers.
Yes.
I'm gonna have a little bit, but I didn't even finish this very small glass of beer, so
True, I can vouch for that.
the science has worked.
That's Science Versus.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Ari Natovich, our wonderful intern here at Science Versus. Your first Science Versus episode is out in the world. Yay. How many citations is in it?
There's 64 citations in this episode.
64. And if people want to see the script with all of its glorious research and citations, where should they go?
You should go to the show notes and you can check out the transcript there.
And next week is our Superbugs episode, where we look at how worried we should be and why they seem to be everywhere.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet. Today, we're pitting facts against old fashions as we look at alcohol. Should we put a cork in it? It feels like we've been yanked around for years about whether drinking a little alcohol is okay or not. Like several years ago, there was news that drinking a glass or two was practically a health food.
There is groundbreaking new research on the benefits of drinking alcohol moderately.
Many studies have shown that drinking a moderate amount of red wine can help the fight against heart disease, Alzheimer's, and some cancers.
1 to 2 glasses of something a day, that might actually be pretty good for you.
But then earlier this year, it felt like public health wonks from Canada pissed in everyone's beer by saying the healthiest thing to do here? Think about taking it easy on those daily drinks.
New guidance out this week on drinking alcohol. Experts recommending no more than 2 drinks a week.
Other reports seem to take things even further.
We hate to be the ones to break some sobering news to you, but a major new study says no amount of alcohol is good for your overall health.
Even that 1 glass of wine at dinner does more harm than good.
No amount of alcohol is good for you, not even a little bit.
Is this thing that a lot of us love doing after a stressful day at work really killing us? Well, it turns out that what we thought was a fairly simple question took us down this rabbit hole where things just got curiouser and curiouser until it became almost impossible to know what to think. So might as well give up, eh? Never. Here at Science Versus, there is no question too confusing, no research quagmire too sticky. Strap on your beer goggles and get yourself ready for a peer-reviewed adventure to find out once and for all, is alcohol good for us or not?
All right, chat.
When it comes to alcohol, there's a lot of opinions.
For right now,
but
let's see
then
time.
there's science.
Gonna be on tonight around midnight.
Science versus
so
alcohol
If you want
is
to tune
coming up
in, that's
just
when
after
I'll
the
be
break.
live again.
Cheers.
I'll leave this podcast on. Pause it. Adios.